Alright, in this section we're having a look at the greenhouse effect, but more specifically the enhanced greenhouse effect. So this has been very topical over the last 15 years, and it's one of those things that everyone seems to have an opinion on the greenhouse effect and climate change and what's affecting it. So we're going to take a look at the facts here in this section. We are specifically interested in what the common greenhouse gases are, in particular carbon dioxide and methane, but water is also another common one of those, and we'll take a look at that later. And we're going to have a look at how they have been important in the natural greenhouse effect. So there's two separate ideas here. One is that the Earth needed to have some heat trapped, otherwise it wouldn't be okay for us to live on, and so some of the heat is actually good. But the enhancement of this, so the enhanced greenhouse effect, has to do with the increased number of these gases in the Earth's atmosphere that are able to trap the heat, and that's due to human activity. So you can see these two ideas outlined here from the subject outline. So oxygen and nitrogen make up a significant portion of the Earth's atmosphere. So that's, if we take a look, we've got oxygen and nitrogen. You've seen these before. They make up heaps of the atmosphere. The issue with these molecules is that these bonds are, although covalent, non-polar bonds because they're diatomic molecules or molecules with the same type of atom. So because of this, there's no way for them to absorb the light, and therefore they can't re-radiate it back down. So we can see here a fairly standard picture. We've got a sun here, and it's got light being radiated down. Fairly standard, you all know about that. It hits the Earth's surface and it re-radiates back out. We can see here delta 2. So delta, whether or not you've seen this in the past, delta is a symbol for wavelength. So we can see that it's coming in here, wavelength number 1, going back out, wavelength number 2. Once wavelength number 2 hits particular gases in the atmosphere, and let's pick on something like CO2. So we'll draw CO, and we've got the double bonds here. These are polar covalent bonds. So it hits this and then is re-radiated back down to the Earth's surface. So let's recap this. We have the greenhouse effect. This is the greenhouse effect that we need. Natural, it keeps the planet warm enough. So this has happened regardless with no human intervention. We have the enhanced greenhouse effect that's been caused from human intervention. So where does this come from? These are things that you'll already know about, and some we've covered already. So CO2. We're used to being told if we drive less, we'll have less CO2 emissions. So anything that's combustion. And that includes cars and industry where we're burning things. The combustion of fuels produces CO2. Other things that we know cause the enhanced greenhouse effect are methane. So CH4. So methane is produced particularly from cattle and sheep, so cows and sheep, as they pass wind. That methane is then being released into the atmosphere. So when we get concerned about methane, I guess the reason that humans have caused such intervention in the production of cattle is we've got increased number of stock because we've got increased population. And both of these you can see happen as a result of clearing. So when we're talking about methane production, we've had to clear trees to have a spot for farming. And when we're talking about combustion, the clearing of trees for cities means that we have increased amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere, but we also have reduced amounts of trees which would be able to consume that CO2 and convert it into oxygen, like you've seen before in photosynthesis. So we have a twofold effect. One, we've got human activity causing these things, and the second is that the human activity that's caused these things has also resulted in no way of converting these greenhouse gases into something useful. The third molecule that's of concern is H2O. Now, we've seen a lot of water in the atmosphere. We see it when we get rain. One of the concerns with H2O in the atmosphere is that we have the ice caps melting as it increased global temperatures. If the ice caps melt, there's more water available, more water is likely to go into the atmosphere, and that can also cause extra greenhouse gases for the increased temperature or climate change as a result of the enhanced greenhouse effect. Alright, so human activity that's led to it, we've talked about some, so let's recap. There's a huge demand on fossil fuels. So this demand on fossil fuels leads to the increased combustion of fossil fuels and increased CO2 in the atmosphere. Land's being cleared for agriculture, hence the methane, and again, less photosynthesis, less CO2 being removed. One of the ones we didn't talk about is dam building. This is drowning vegetation. So things like reservoirs are our dams that we're talking about in this case. We need a lot more access to water. So we build these big dams to give us access to water. This then drowns the vegetation. As the vegetation that's being drowned has no access to oxygen, it undergoes anaerobic decay instead of aerobic decay, and this then builds in the decaying process. This then produces methane. That methane is a gas and it gets released into the atmosphere. So in general, we're talking about more CO2 and CH4 and a warmer atmosphere. So as a result of this, it's quite likely that there's going to be more severe weather events in parts of the world. And we've seen that. We've seen the biggest tsunami on record in Japan. So with the Japanese tsunami, we've seen a lot more typhoons in places like the Philippines. We've had large cyclones in northern Queensland. We're seeing a lot more of these extreme weather patterns. We also saw some consecutive floods a couple of years ago on the eastern seaboard. So once in 50 years events, we were having 2 or 3 of them. Another implication for this is because of the changing weather patterns, we're going to see changing migration patterns of plants and animals. So birds will migrate in different ways than they have in the past, and we'll see different patterns so if climate changes in a certain region, plants are able to grow there that weren't before, and we'll see changes in the types of plants that were grown. So similarly, changing vegetation due to rainfall or temperature changes. The other thing that's of concern is disease locations. So if we have changing weather patterns, diseases that weren't previously able to survive in an area, such as Japanese encephalitis, Ross River, and malaria, are going to be more abundant in areas they weren't previously existing in. So take a look at this short video just to recap the molecule aspect of what goes on in the enhanced greenhouse effect.
Antarctica, the coldest place on Earth. This seems a strange place to study global warming, but by drilling deep into the ice, scientists get vital clues to the Earth's past climate. It's part of the effort to answer the biggest environmental questions of our time. Is our planet getting warmer? And are we the cause? We all know that air provides us with oxygen, but until recently, few of us knew that the atmosphere plays another vital role. Without our thin blanket of air, Earth's average temperature would be minus 18 degrees Celsius, too cold for most forms of life. In fact, the atmosphere gives us a much more comfortable average temperature of around 15 degrees Celsius. How does this work? The energy that sustains life comes from the sun, mostly as visible light. Clouds reflect a small part back into space, but most is absorbed by the Earth's surface. Now here's the crucial point. The warmed surface radiates energy back into the air, but as infrared waves, which have longer wavelengths than visible light. Most of this infrared is absorbed by air particles, and the net result is a warming effect on the atmosphere. So the atmosphere lets the light energy in, but traps the heat energy radiated back from the Earth's surface. This is the greenhouse effect. Does this explain how human activity could warm the planet? Not quite. We need to look a little more closely at air. It consists almost entirely of two gases. Nearly 4/5 is nitrogen and about 1/5 oxygen. Careful analysis also shows minute traces of other gases. One of these is carbon dioxide. It makes up only a few hundred particles per million. So which gases absorb infrared? Surprisingly, it's only carbon dioxide and some of the other trace gases. If carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, you'd expect that the more there is in the atmosphere, the more the temperature will increase. Climate scientists began regular measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations in the 1950s at a weather station in Hawaii. As you can see, the levels have been rising ever since. Here are the average air temperatures for the same period. We can go back much further in time using indirect measuring methods. Is this dramatic increase due to natural processes or human activity? We need to look at what affects atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Green plants absorb carbon dioxide from the air. Their leaves, nature's solar panels, combine carbon dioxide and water using the sun's energy to produce glucose molecules. This process is called photosynthesis. Phytoplankton do the same thing in the oceans, using dissolved carbon dioxide. What happens to this carbon now locked up in organic molecules? Some is eaten by animals or humans, who break it down to carbon dioxide and water, releasing energy. This is the process of respiration.